Hello, hello. Welcome back to this week's episode of Behind the Workflow. My name is Simona Costantini.
And I'm Taly, Melo.
And this is the show where we are pulling back the curtain on how podcasters, agencies, and creators actually get things done. Every episode, we have a candid conversation with industry pros, sharing real strategies, real systems, and stories that you can use to level up your own podcast workflow. And today we have a really fun guest. Really excited to dive in and to chat with her. Our guest today is Andreea Coscai, a podcast producer and marketer with international experience and a deep passion for multicultural storytelling. She's the founder and editor of Eurowaves, a newsletter that shines a spotlight on European podcasts and industries. And she works with Tink Media and Earbuds Podcast Collective to help podcasters grow and engage their audiences. Our episode today is brought to you by Northflow, the all-in-one content planning platform built for podcasters and teams who want to stay organized and in control. From mapping out episodes to tracking tasks and managing every step of pre- and post-production, Northflow keeps it all in one place so you can spend less time juggling tools and more time creating. Speaking of making an impact in the podcasting world, our guest today knows a thing or two about standing out. So we are so excited to have her here. And she is just so incredible. So anyways, welcome to the podcast. We are happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm excited to get into the conversation.
Me too. For those who may not know you yet, what is Eurowaves all about? And how did it come to life? And maybe a little bit about what else you're involved in. I named a lot of different things.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to take it back a little bit to the beginning of my podcasting journey to give context. So I was working in marketing, social media, that type of work before actually getting into podcasting. And my first jobs when it comes to this industry, it was in production. And I was having a really good time. I was working as a freelancer. I was working with different clients, mostly independent podcasters. But as you might know, working as a freelancer in the space is difficult because there's so much competition. So people usually are looking for like NPR credits for those kinds of things, which makes a lot of sense. But when you're starting out, you'd have to do that with an internship, right? They don't have the internships anymore, but they used to be like $15 to $20 an hour, which is rough. I'm originally from Romania, but I lived in the States for 5 years. So I was trying to find different just projects. And then I got into social media for podcasting and I discovered Tink Media, where I've been for 2.5 years at this point. It's been such an amazing journey doing podcast marketing, PR, and growth. I'm so excited to talk about all of that and the systems behind it and everything, because you have to be so on point and organized to be able to do it and then have fun with it. And once I got into that a little bit, I came back to Romania. So I've been in Europe for 2 years now. And I was feeling like so separated from the work I was doing because I mainly work with American podcasters or British podcasters, and I'm in Europe. And I'm trying to look at what's going on here. I'm trying to look at the Romanian industry, but it's obviously very different. So for a while, it was making me feel like, I wish half of me was still in the States, half of me is still here. And I said, no, you know what? That's actually a great opportunity because there are very few to no people, very few people who are trying to like make these connections in European podcasting, find common threads, create communities. So that's how Eurowaves came about in December of last year. It's been not really a year even so far, but the newsletter has grown so much. People are so interested, like a community is forming again, because people were kind of craving this space. That's pretty much it. I got into production a little bit again, strategy in Podvision with my co-founder, Julian, that you have also spoken with. So yeah, that's been my journey so far.
That's amazing. And I want to ask a little bit about the difference of the podcasting landscape that we see in North America versus the podcasting landscape that we see in Europe, because they are quite different. And I would love just your perspective on what some of those differences are and how you see things shaping and forming.
I think the biggest difference, honestly, is perception depending on where you are. So if you're a European podcaster, and we're not counting the UK here, not for European Union reasons, but just because it's such a different market. So if you're a European podcaster, you're definitely looking to the States for best practices and just thinking, wow, the industry is so developed, it's doing so well. And then also to the UK, because it's kind of like a similar situation. Everyone is aspiring to that. In the UK, because I've spoken with so many British podcasters, I was at the podcast show in London. They're also looking towards the States. And in the States, everyone's thinking, oh my God, what's going on in the industry right now? Like all the big players are making moves. So the perception is a huge difference. I would say, monetization is something that I've found to be pretty similar, for example. So, even though in the States, there's so much more brand sponsorship. You get a lot more branded podcasts. That's less available in Europe. But when it comes to counting on your listeners and on a community for, monetizing and making your podcast sustainable, that's pretty similar because, we're looking at live events, we're looking at paid subscriptions, we're looking at bonus content and all those kinds of things. So that's one, common thread that I've seen. And this is something that's always on my mind and that I always report on.
Wow. That's so fascinating.
It really is. And this show, we love to talk about like workflows. But since you also are an expert in other parts, we're gonna change a little bit. But starting with workflow, I would love to understand a little bit of like how you do your own workflow, either for yourself, for your own shows, or for your clients. Talking about like different tools, like your whole process. If it's a client, like how you do the client onboarding, if you have any SOPs, all of that. Share it all with us.
Yes, I will. And I'm going to share all the secrets. And I love this conversation because I am an organization freak. Anyone will tell you that. Julian will tell you that. People from Tink will tell you that. I just need to be organized. Because again, if you have everything in place, that allows you to then be creative and have fun with it and things like that. So I would say one good example that I do in marketing is making sure, and I use a lot of, maybe they're considered like even rudimental tools at this point, but I'm like always on Google Drive, Google Sheets, spreadsheets, like documents, all of that. And I need to make sure that I have a proper folder, right? So I have a folder where, especially at Tink, we really have the structure. So there's an internal spreadsheet for the different podcasts we research and we pitch to. And, we obviously have the contact information. We have like notes on different angles. We have just all these kinds of pieces of information like that help us later on when pitching. And something that I love to do, for example, in the notes section is if I'm pitching a client to be a guest on a different show, or if I'm pitching for a promo swap, we really personalize our pitches. So I don't want to send out a letter and just be like, hey, love your show, but never listen to it, because I do listen to it. I take a look at the feed. I see what it's about. I see if it's a match. So like I actually get into the details of that. And then I also make sure to specify why is it a good fit, or what can my client talk about on your show? Instead of sending like a list of bullet points with, they can talk about XYZ because they're so cool, and they are cool, but like, why are they cool for you? So making sure that I have all that information recorded there makes the pitching so much easier. We have, of course, like our templates for pitches. And again, they're so highly personalized, but making sure that you have all the basic information there, what's, the most important things, and then adding some comments with, okay, we're going to personalize by, I don't know, maybe for one show, it's more important to mention that a client has a specific sponsorship or has been endorsed by a specific institution, or, I'm like always keeping in mind what is building the connection between these two podcasts, or between my client and the show if they're a guest. Those are the kind of things in my personal workflows, because I juggle a lot of clients. We're talking about Tink, we're talking about Eurowaves, we're talking about Podvision. My head is scrambled, I have to say. Like sometimes I feel like my head is all over the place. So I always need to have a schedule the week before already done. So for example, right now, of course, I know exactly what I'm doing next week, but not only that, I'm like scheduling it per days, right? So depending on when I have a call with a certain client, depending on also what's sustainable for me. Maybe for Eurowaves, I always have things that I'm planning to do to develop it, but I'm like, whoa, okay, take a step back. How much can you do right now? So like making sure that it's in actionable steps and that it's actually feasible really helps me get to the goal. Sometimes it also helps me procrastinate, which I tried to stop because I'm like, oh, I did a little bit, I made some progress here, but come on, let's get it out into the world.
You're so funny. I see so much of myself in what you're saying also, because Taly will be the first one to tell you, like, when it comes to systems and structures and all that, I'm organized to a point where it works. You know what I mean? Like, everything works. The whole system is like all together. Like, that's all great. But I'm also someone who's a little bit more like lax. I'm like, oh, let's see how it goes, whatever. But I always have my to-do list done. I always know exactly. I could tell you what I'm doing 3 weeks from now. I already know. You know what I mean? So it's like there's like that side of like organization that you would need to kind of have when you're juggling so many things and wearing so many different hats, that I think sets you up for success and allows you to create a little bit of space for those one-off things that get pulled in here and there, which I think is really, really important. So if you think about different independent podcasters that are wearing all of these different hats, what would be the first system or process that you'd recommend putting in place to make their growth and their marketing more manageable? Because production we talk about all the time, but there's not a lot of conversation around actual marketing and actual growth.
I love this question. And I was just taking a look at your episodes and other people that have been on. And I know you guys had a conversation with Anna Xavier, and I absolutely love her. And one of the takeaways that I saw your guys' conversation was like, don't have 14 steps, just narrow it down to 7. So one of the first things I would suggest to independent podcasters, because like you're saying, it's just so many different jobs. You're making this podcast, right? You're not just producing it, you're marketing it. So I would say the best thing to do, and we even do this ourselves, and I do it when I work on marketing, is prioritize. That's it. It's so simple. Prioritize. If you have a new show that you're launching, if you're having a new season, start with buzz building and give it your all. Pitch 2 podcasting newsletters, pitch 2 apps, to get featured. Like, really, really hone in on that, focus on that, because you can do swaps. You can appear on other shows, but take it step by step, especially if time doesn't really allow it for you. Make sure that's really your priority, because that will also get you the most ears to listen to what you actually made.
And if a podcast agency wanted to bring more of a global perspective into like their client strategy, I want to talk a little bit about that. Like, where should they start researching partnerships or like something else? What would you advise?
I love this question because I also just recently did a takeover on the podcast Magic Marketing newsletter from Tink. And I talked about this specifically, like, how do you reach out for marketing globally, right? But we are also talking about like production here. I would say, first of all, if you're not doing that, you're missing out. If you're staying in your own bubble, locally, content-wise, from any perspective, you are missing out big time. So I would say the first thing is definitely do some research, but do it for yourself. If you're a podcaster, I sure hope you listen to podcasts. Some people don't. Some podcasters don't. And it blows my mind. So you most likely listen to podcasts, right? Start listening to podcasts if you're from the States, start listening to them from the UK. Start listening to Australian podcasts. Start listening to some podcasts from Singapore that are in English. I listened to one recently about pop culture that was so fun. Just, European ones. If you speak different languages, leverage that too. I'm a big language fan, and so I feel like podcasting is such a cool tool to keep educating yourself and improve your skills in that way. Once you have done that, figure out kind of what you appreciate about what they do, content wise, but also marketing wise, and then see how you could work together. And just keep in mind as you're doing this, you're experimenting. A lot of people are not really thinking in this way. So you're going to have to analyze these things. You're going to have to think outside of the box. It's going to be a trial and error. Not everybody's going to be open to it. And one more thing is to pay attention to your content, because if you're going to start marketing your show or working with podcasters from all around the world, you need to realize that people from different cultures are going to come to you, and you'll notice the cultural differences when you listen to those global shows and then start realizing your own. So don't change your whole podcast, of course, but make sure that you adapt it in a way that's universal and it's applicable to people from all these different countries you're going to bring in.
That is such great advice. And I had this experience this year. So Anna, the podcast space, her and I, like all of us, we chat all the time. And so a couple of years ago, she had introduced me to the International Women's Podcasting Awards that happened like in London. And so I judged those last year, and then they had asked me back again this year, and I speak other languages. So they had asked me to judge some of the language podcasts. And I was like, at first I was like, oh my gosh, it was like 20 podcasts in totally different languages, like that I didn't speak because, whatever. And it was such an interesting experience in the best possible way. So I got to listen to 20 different shows that I would never have listened to otherwise because they're not in English or French or Italian or anything like that. So hard to listen to. Hard for me to understand. Let me correct myself. Hard for me to understand. And when I was listening to them, it's so interesting how you can still gain and understand the story arc of what someone is saying, even if you don't speak the language. And of course, they provide you a transcript so you can actually understand like what they're saying, but you can follow along. But I have to say, so many of these shows were so creative. The way they used sound design, sound engineering, sound effects, pauses, intentional breaks, all this stuff. I'm like, they're like masterpieces, and they're being produced by one or two people. It's not a huge team. I think sometimes we get stuck in this like level of creativity. You know what I mean? It's like, you have to do the show like this. It's a talk show. You got to go on here and you got to talk, and like, this is what you got to do. But it's like, my gosh, like the experience that you can have, you feel fully. Like this one show, I think it was like something related to like war, something political. I can't really quite remember, but I felt immersed in the experience from the sounds that they were using. And I just think that is so powerful that we forget as creators, we get to actually be creative. That's like a whole part of it,
I love that. Yeah. I mean, I love narrative podcasts. I love fiction podcasts for that reason. And I think like people who truly love podcasting get it, because audio is such a beautiful, precious medium, right? Like exactly, because you're so immersed, and the fact that you can even understand the way a story goes just from the sound is mind-blowing.
It's incredible. And so let's shift a little bit into newsletters, because this is a huge piece of some of the work that you do. So if we think about newsletters as a marketing engine, I'm a huge fan of newsletters. I think there's a lot of power in them. So you run Eurowaves, which we've already talked about. It's both a resource and it's a marketing channel. So how can agencies or podcasters use newsletters, not just to share updates, but to actually grow an audience? And do you have an opinion on the type of newsletters that are shared when a new episode is dropped, or like how that is done? You know how sometimes, people will have a newsletter or like a new podcast episode, and then they send a newsletter just about that podcast episode. I've tried so many different things within my agency. I'll send just the podcast episode. Sometimes, then I was like, okay, maybe I should transition it to like more of a roundup, and I put, industry news in there and client spotlights and all kinds of stuff. So I'm just curious on your thoughts, but we can go into that one afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. I already have an idea for that one. So leveraging newsletters. I mean, yeah, like you said, it's such an amazing resource because people are there for a very specific reason, right? Like they're looking for a new podcast to listen to. They're looking for industry news. They're looking for all these things. So I would say the most important thing is, as an agency, as a podcaster, wherever you're coming from, make sure you have a relationship with those newsletters and the editors. If you're pitching to Eurowaves and you're telling me about an Australian podcast that has nothing to do with Europe, that's not produced in Europe, I'm just like, thanks. Thanks for sending this. Like, you clearly don't read Eurowaves, and it's not even as much of an ego thing, but like, you need to know who you're pitching to, right? And you need to have a relationship. So I love to follow these other newsletters that I work with, that I pitch clients to. So one of the ones that I would love to shout out is Sounds Like Impact, because it's not just a podcasting newsletter, but it's literally about the impact that podcasts can have on the world, right? So each issue is either a curation or an interview with a podcaster that goes on an issue. Can be climate change, can be mental health, can be all these kinds of different things. So in that way, new listeners don't only get to know your show or like get an episode recommended, but it's also discovering your values and what makes you. So that's really important. And then, yeah, just follow these newsletters, keep a relationship with them, get to know them, start like interacting with their content. And that's not just for the sole purpose of pitching, but because you want to be part of this community. So much of podcasting in general, this industry is being part of a community. So that's something that I would definitely do. Let it be a slow burn in the beginning. And once you build those relationships, like really also think of what you can offer back. When it comes to podcasters sending out their own newsletter, I so agree with you because I think, you definitely have to let your listeners know, hey, I dropped a new episode. But sometimes because it's so predictable that's coming in their inbox, maybe they won't open it, or maybe they'll be like, okay, great, I'll check it out later. But if you introduce these different sections that you were talking about, it makes it like so much more, worthwhile. Or if you do issues in between these announcements, like talking about different topics, if you give any paid content, any bonus, kind of behind the scenes, if like anything like that is so cool. I love to hear about a podcaster's process into how they make the actual show. And it's really, podcasting is such a parasocial relationship between the listener and the host. So, making sure that you're like engaging with that, because you want to have that direct connection with your listeners. So another newsletter that I recommend is Podcast Bestie. It has such great resources. And then Courtney Coca actually also announces, new episodes, past episodes. She repurposes so much of her content because her podcast is about podcasting, right? And so that's another thing. I mean, definitely go into repurposing, the episodes you have so far, because I mean, like every podcaster has so much content and so much that they put out. It's a shame to not, reuse it, bring it up again. You have new listeners, you have new audience, or your listeners forgot about it.
100%. Do you have any tips on like the repurposing side? Because when you have so much content, how do you even take that and like really use it on every single platform? You know what I mean? Yes, you do clips. Like, yes,
Yeah.
you can do posts and whatever. But what would you recommend if you have a workflow or if you have, tips and the actual strategy behind it?
I would say, I mean, this really depends if you have, what your podcast is about. But let's say wherever you have your production calendar, you know what episode is coming up, you know the topic, right? So make it part of your workflow. Just literally add another column in there that says link to past episode. And just think, okay, what's relevant? What other episode does this connect to? Because that also helps your listeners see that, I'm giving you this resource, I'm giving you all the information in this episode, but check this out as well. It's kind of like when you're on YouTube, when you're binging someone's channel and they're telling you, oh, you're going to love this one as well. And most of the times I do, so like that gets you more listeners. But like most importantly, it's getting your audience to like stay on there and make use of it. So definitely keep in mind what other past episodes are relevant. And, again, depending on the show, if there's something newsworthy, if there's something in the industry that people are talking about that you've referenced before, you see what you can pull from that and really like bring it to light again.
Yes. And you've talked about the importance of being organized, strategic, and also like creative. So, what's one repeatable system or a checklist that you rely on to make sure like your newsletter is always good to go out on time? And how do you use it?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So what happens is every time I put out an issue, and I just put out an issue of Eurowaves today, I'm already looking at what's coming up in the following weeks, right? So for example, one of my sections is having podcasters share recommendations from their country. And they do this in their native language. And then it's also translated in English. It's one of the sections I love the most because, again, I'm such a language fan. And I think like it's just like fascinating. So I look back often, like multiple times a week. Okay, what countries have I covered? And what other countries do I want to cover? Because Eurowaves is also trying to be so all encompassing. I want to make sure that, okay, I cover like all these different regions. That's one thing I do. Another thing I do because I definitely have that content calendar. Yeah. So it's divided up by sections. I mean, after the date, it's like each section. So news, interview, podcast recommendations, the one that I listen to, and then the ones provided by someone else. Another thing that's really important for me is the interview section, because that's really where I highlight a podcaster, creator, whatever it is that they are, and their expertise. And I'm also trying to answer a question. So some of the things that I've gotten into before are monetization, are independent podcasting, narrative, like all these kinds of different issues that are relevant for European podcasting. So one thing I keep in mind is, okay, what's going on in the industry right now? What are the big topics, and what might my subscribers be thinking of? So today's interview, for example, is about fair pay, which I think is such an interesting and important topic. And one of the ones I have coming up is about fiction. And I reached out on LinkedIn as well to my community and was like, are you in fiction? Do you know someone who's in fiction? Can you put me in touch? Because it's a huge topic I really want to make sure that I cover. So yeah, that's one of the other things. So it's constantly on my mind. When I read pod news every day, I look at what the news are. And if it's something relevant to me about European podcasting, I copy paste it in there so that when I actually write the newsletter, it takes me 2 hours, I would say, from start to end to write it, to, put in the interview, correct it, all these kinds of things, and even post on social media. So I've made it like very sustainable, and it's kind of like a game too, like, okay, how fast can I do it?
That's actually so funny. Now, there's people who sit on both sides of email marketing, right? There's people who are like, yep, it works every single time. And then there's people who are like, I don't read any newsletters or any emails, so I would never do this in my business. I would never do this for my podcast or anything like that. How do you measure I want to say success, but I'm not really sure that's the right word. Like, how do you measure the impact that your newsletter has on your community? Are you measuring that through growth? Are you measuring it through people who are engaging, opens, clicks, like all of the things? And what are you hoping that they do with the newsletter when people are reading it?
Yeah, I'm definitely looking at all those metrics. I'm looking at opens, I'm looking at clicks, I'm looking at, for example, one of the things I noticed is when I share the podcast I listen to, people don't really click on that section. And it makes me wonder why. And I think I'm going to ask them just directly at some point. I think that's super important if you have a newsletter, or a podcast. I mean, in any case, just communicate directly with your audience and just ask them, plain and simple. You have to know how to go about it, right? Like how to ask them, how to make it the easiest for them to respond and things like that, but just be upfront. Another thing I do is definitely, collaborations for growth. And for example, for my first year, my goal is to reach 1,500 subscribers. Right now, I'm at about 800, which is good. I'm getting there, but I also don't want to get too stuck up on the numbers because they don't tell the full story. So when I'm looking at the graph right now, it's just consistently going up. There might be a time when there's a peak. There might be a time when there's a drop. Who knows? Maybe I'll get to, I'll probably get tired like a year from now or something and just take a break and people won't sign up as much. But making sure that it's consistently growing is something that I really keep an eye out for. And then given that it's a European newsletter, it's these collaborations that I was talking about, right? So reaching out to the newsletters I follow, to the ones that are from different countries and being like, hey, let's exchange audiences. Like I have German subscribers that would love to be subscribed to your German newsletter and maybe don't know about it. You have, German subscribers that don't know about Eurowaves and are probably interested in what's going on in Europe. Yeah, it's a lot of those kinds of things. And it's actively, like, consistently doing those.
I love that. I also like that you're not overly hung up on the numbers because I've done so many different things. I've been invited to speak at so many different places and they're like, you need to have 10,000 people on your list. And I'm like, what does that even mean? What metric are you actually measuring? Because I could have 10,000 people on my list and I could have, 200 people that open it, or, you can have 800 people on your list and you can have 90% of the people that open it. Which one would you rather?
Exactly. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, people that actually open and read the newsletter, right?
I love that. I always
like to ask this question. So if you could go back like to day one when you started like growing Eurowaves and also like Pod Vision, you choose which one you want to answer. But like, what is like one thing or like one workflow boundary you wish you had set earlier, for a client or just like for yourself? Because I know we always have to put boundaries for ourselves as well.
I love that question. And I've given it some thought. I guess for Euroways, I would have been a lot more confident in my structure and not as much worried about it, because I feel like I spent a lot of time on that and the workflows and the organization, again, because I'm like, that is priority for me. And once I was confident in that, even as I started posting the first issues, I was still like pretty concentrated on it and being like, okay, do I have all the content for it? Do I have, maybe it's also because it's one of the first newsletters that I'm really focusing on. That's my own as well. So I wanted to make sure that it's, following what I set out to do for it. But this is the point, and I feel like this is also just a progression of time naturally, where I'm like, okay, I have everything in place. I've covered some of the basic stuff. Let me really think, do I want to focus more on founders? Do I want to focus more in the coming months on things that are happening in the industry and try to get some of these big players to like comment on these kinds of issues, So really letting myself be like, okay, I'm confident in like how everything is set up, how it's going, and now I have the freedom to think about that. But again, I think that's just a progression of time naturally as well. And I would say when it comes to Podvision and podcast marketing in general, one of the things is, again, okay, now I have the workflow, now I have the list, now I have that structure, I have all of that. So let me think a little bit strategically of, for example, if I'm pitching my client's show for swaps and I have, I don't know, 30 shows I want to pitch to. Let me kind of structure it in my brain, in my workflow, and like kind of creatively as well. First of all, I'm reaching out to the shows that have the same topic. Then I'm going into it, a little bit more out of the box, a little bit more creative. What is my client really passionate about? Maybe my client really likes, I don't know, a specific genre of movies. Why don't I have this client go on different shows and talk about that so that people get to see a different side of them and then, kind of be interested and come to their feed and see what they're about and what their whole podcast is. Yeah, those are some of the things I would say. I think it's, like workflows and creativity, they're just so much embedded one into another, and like constantly thinking of how to make these better for yourself to allow yourself that freedom and creativity is just, it's a priority, and it's what keeps whatever project you're working on going and like consistently growing.
I love
Yes,
that. Go
yes,
ahead, Taly,
and I totally agree. Like when I think about workflow, I feel like workflow enables you to be creative. If you're doing it right. If you're not, then not so much.
That's such a good point. Pulling off of everything that you just shared, because there's so much gold in there. And I love when people give actual tangible advice that people can take and implement. That's not fluff. So that's fantastic. We love to pull in a couple of key takeaways at the end of each episode, just so our listener can go off with something like that's actually, okay, I can take this and I can implement it. I'm going to list what I have on my list. If you let me know if I'm missing anything. But one of the first ones is the difference between the European and the North American markets, and how we need to watch each other's markets, and how we need to see and be curious and be excited about what each is doing. And maybe we can learn. There's opportunities to learn from each other in that way. The next one was listening to new shows, listening to podcasts, like actually listening to podcasts, seeing what people are doing, and showing, I don't know, not showing that like you care, but like actually taking care in what other people are creating, I think is so important. The next one is organization and tools that help you get to where you want to go. So key. And I will add in that Northflow is a tool that can help you do that. So I have to plug in our Northflow tool for that as well. The next one is intentional pitching. So really caring about what you're saying to people, what it is you're talking to people about, the angle that you're taking to approach people, and not just have it be like cut and paste, cut and paste, cut and paste. And then the last one that I wrote down is leveraging your email marketing and the importance of actually repurposing your content, because truly, if you're not going to talk about it, other people aren't going to talk about it. So you need to be so excited about what you're doing and not be afraid to share. Is there anything else that you would add to our key takeaways?
I love all of that. I would say, because I got this idea earlier, also kind of before we started recording, since we were talking about Brazilian podcasting, keep an eye out for industry news like consistently. In podcasting, I would say it's so important to know the industry. It's so important to know, again, like people's podcasts when you're pitching, but like also more of an overview of what's going on, where your place is in the industry. I feel like, again, Eurowaves came to be because there was an opportunity. There was a space that like no one was occupying. So the fact that happened was such a huge plus in making Eurowaves skyrocket. And like experiment with these different tools that are coming out, talk to people, start conversations, just do all those kinds of things to be part of the community. And referring back to our conversation in the beginning again, I listened to the Brazilian podcast that we were talking about with auto dubbing in English from YouTube. And that was such an interesting experience because I heard him talk about it at the podcast show in London. And it just, especially when we're talking about like global podcasting and European connections and like just global connections in general, that's such a cool tool to leverage. Apple has, transcripts that you can follow, that you can translate. So yeah, just make sure you're in the know, make sure you're organized, you're staying on top of things. However that looks for you, it may not look at all like how it does for me, but make sure it makes sense for you. And then like you guys were saying as well, I think this conclusion is very important. Then it will allow you that creativity and the freedom to just, keep progressing and do different things and stand out in your own way.
And I have one that you said that it really stood out for me, which is look for opportunities everywhere. Talk to people and really collaborate and across promotions and all the cultural tie-ins as well. So I love that. So I have one more question, and basically, like, what's one piece of advice you would give to either a podcaster or an agency that's ready to go global but struggling to figure out how?
I would say, again, really assess internally, assess individually and assess as a team. Why are you doing this? What are you hoping to get out of it? And how can you do it in a sustainable way? And then kind of go back to the steps we talked about earlier, right? Like researching, listening to things yourself, identifying all those things, making sure that in your outreach, again, you're very intentional. So that's why from the get-go, you have to be really specific as to why you're doing this and really take a moment to ground yourself. And then analyze metrics, look at the downloads, how they're changing. Look at, your newsletter. If you have a newsletter, who's coming in? Look at your social media, look at your ratings, look at your reviews, all those kinds of different things. And always keep in mind to adapt your content and adapt what you're doing for, global audiences, if that's your goal.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much again for the invitation. I had such a great time. And yeah, I love talking about all these things anytime.
Amazing. Us too. We may have to have you back in the future so we can do a part 2 because I feel like there's so much more we can dive into. Where would you like our listener to find you today and connect with you? What's the best next step?
They can find me on LinkedIn, where I post a bunch of, updates about Eurowaves. They can also find me on Instagram if they want, Andreea Coscai. That's where I share a lot of podcast recommendations. They're always on my stories. So if you're looking for something to add to your queue, and Eurowavessubstack.com, of course. Yeah, join the community. And if you want to be a part of the listserv as well, there's a Google group for European podcasters that is really helpful as well, because it's the only one that there is, as far as I know. So if you want to be added, let me know.
That's amazing. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Behind the Workflow. And we will see you next time. Bye for now.